When American P-47 Thunderbolts appeared in European skies in mid-1943, the balance of air power shifted dramatically against the Luftwaffe. German pilots, once masters of the air, suddenly found themselves facing an adversary that seemed to defy destruction. It was like shooting at a flying tank, recalled Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff in a post-war interview. You could empty your guns into it, and it would still keep coming. The reality for German pilots facing the P-47 was nothing short of terrifying, a psychological shift that would ultimately contribute to the crumbling of German air superiority over Europe. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The emergence of the P-47 Thunderbolt over European battlefields represented a pivotal moment in aerial warfare. By late 1943, the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe had become a deadly arena where technological superiority often meant the difference between life and death. For the previous 3 years, Luftwaffe pilots had enjoyed significant advantages in experience, tactics, and often equipment. The appearance of this new American fighter plane marked a psychological turning point that went beyond mere technical specifications. The P-47 entered the European theater at a critical juncture. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany was intensifying, but bomber losses were unsustainable. Flying from bases in England, the mighty 8th Air Force was bleeding aircraft at an alarming rate. Deep penetration raids into Germany left American bombers vulnerable once their escort fighters, limited by fuel range, were forced to turn back. In this gap, Luftwaffe defenders could attack with relative impunity, picking off the lumbering bomber formations. Something had to change. The strategic situation in early 1943 was precarious for Allied air forces. The British had switched to night bombing to reduce losses, while American commanders remained committed to daylight precision bombing. This doctrine rested on two dangerous assumptions: that the heavily armed B-17 and B-24 bombers could defend themselves against fighter attacks, and that destroying key industrial targets would cripple Germany's war machine. Both assumptions were being severely tested. The infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, 1943, saw 60 B-17s shot down out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of nearly 16% in a single mission. At that rate, an entire bomber group could be wiped out in just 7 missions. Enter the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter plane that seemed to contradict conventional wisdom about aircraft design. Where German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were relatively small, nimble aircraft, the P-47 was enormous. Pilots joked it was a bathtub with wings. Weighing over 7 tons fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. Powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine, the P-47 was initially met with skepticism by pilots accustomed to more agile aircraft. The brainchild of Russian immigrant Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's chief designer, the P-47, had been developed to meet a U.S. Army Air Corps specification for a high-altitude interceptor. Its turbo-supercharged engine maintained power at altitudes where other engines lost performance, making it particularly effective at the bombing altitudes where Allied formations operated. But it was another feature entirely that would earn the aircraft its fearsome reputation and create psychological terror among German pilots: its nearly unmatched durability. The P-47's airframe was built around its 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, and the massive armor plating protecting both the engine and the pilot. Unlike water-cooled engines used in many fighters, including the Spitfire and Bf-109, the P-47's radial engine could continue functioning despite significant damage. Multiple cylinder failures would not immediately down the aircraft, and the lack of a vulnerable cooling system eliminated a critical weakness that German pilots had exploited in other Allied fighters. When P-47s began escorting bombing missions in significant numbers by late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots encountered a disconcerting reality. Tactics that had worked against earlier escorts like the P-38 Lightning and P-39 Airacobra proved ineffective against the Thunderbolt. Head-on attacks, previously a favored tactic against Allied fighters, became suicide missions against the heavily armed P-47. Its 8 machine guns could deliver a devastating 800 rounds per second, creating a wall of lead that few German aircraft could survive. Worse still, from the German perspective, was the discovery that their own standard armament often failed to bring down the heavily armored American fighter. Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Keller, a Bf-109 pilot with JG-27, recorded his frustration in a diary recovered after the war. "Today I had a Thunderbolt in my sights for what seemed an eternity. I could see my rounds striking the fuselage and wings, but it continued flying as if untouched. Then it turned toward me, and I had to break off or be torn apart by its guns. These Americans have built something truly formidable." This experience was not unique. Throughout Luftwaffe squadrons, pilots began sharing similar stories of P-47s absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any German fighter. The physical reality of the P-47's durability soon translated into a psychological advantage. German pilots began approaching engagements with Thunderbolts differently than they did other Allied fighters. Reports filtered back to Luftwaffe High Command of pilots breaking off attacks prematurely or avoiding engagement entirely when facing formations of P-47s. This hesitation represented a significant shift in the air war's psychological dynamics. For the first time, elite Luftwaffe fighter groups were showing reluctance to engage certain Allied fighters, a development that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Hauptmann Egon Mayer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 100 victories, who would later be killed in action, admitted in a tactical briefing, "When you attack Thunderbolts, you must commit fully and aim for the cockpit or the engine from behind. Side attacks against the wings or fuselage are often ineffective. If you cannot achieve such a position, it is better to seek other targets." This tacit acknowledgement of the P-47's superiority in certain aspects of combat represented a significant admission from one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders. The psychological impact extended beyond individual engagements. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting the distinctive silhouette of the P-47, with its massive radial engine creating a round profile unlike the sleeker, liquid-cooled engine fighters, at exaggerated ranges. Fear had begun influencing perception. German squadrons would sometimes abort intercept missions based on reports of P-47s, only for intelligence to later determine that no Thunderbolts had been in the area. This phenomenon, documented in Luftwaffe command reports from late 1943, demonstrated how the P-47's reputation had taken on a psychological dimension that affected German operations beyond actual encounters. Weather conditions that had once favored German defenders now worked against them. The P-47's performance improved significantly at high altitudes, precisely where bomber formations flew and where Luftwaffe interceptors needed to operate. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine maintained power while German fighters struggled with decreasing performance. Oberleutnant Werner Mulders, a tactical innovator who led JG-51, noted in his combat report, "The Americans have solved the high-altitude fighter problem. Our aircraft lose too much performance above 7,000 meters, while their Thunderbolts seem to gain strength." By early 1944, the psychological impact of facing P-47s had begun affecting Luftwaffe pilot morale. New pilots arriving at frontline units heard veteran stories about Thunderbolts surviving direct hits and delivering devastating firepower in return. Training increasingly focused on techniques to avoid P-47 strengths, a defensive mindset, that contrasted sharply with the aggressive tactics that had characterized earlier Luftwaffe operations. Meanwhile, Allied pilots grew increasingly confident, willing to press attacks against German formations that previously would have held decisive advantages. The experience of facing P-47s was particularly traumatic for newer Luftwaffe pilots with limited combat experience. As Germany's pilot training program deteriorated under the pressures of fuel shortages and constant Allied bombing, fresh pilots arrived at combat units with fewer flight hours and less gunnery practice than their predecessors. These inexperienced aviators now faced American pilots flying increasingly sophisticated aircraft. The mismatch in both equipment and training created a downward spiral in Luftwaffe effectiveness. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the famed Star of Africa who had scored 158 victories primarily against British aircraft before his death in 1942, would likely have struggled against the new generation of American fighters. His preferred tactic of close-range deflection shooting would have put him within the P-47's devastating cone of fire, a deadly proposition even for a pilot of his exceptional skill. The era of the lone ace racking up enormous victory counts was ending, replaced by a war of attrition that favored Allied industrial capacity and growing technical advantages. The psychological burden on German pilots increased further as fuel restrictions limited their training flights. American pilots typically arrived in theater with 400-plus hours of flight time and extensive gunnery practice. By 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots might have as little as 120 hours total before facing combat. This disparity meant German pilots were not only facing a formidable opponent in the P-47, but doing so with inadequate preparation. The knowledge of this disadvantage further eroded confidence among Luftwaffe squadrons. As 1944 progressed, the introduction of external fuel tanks extended the P-47's range dramatically, allowing it to escort bombers deep into Germany and even on the return journey. This development eliminated the sanctuary that German defenders had previously enjoyed once Allied escorts reached their range limits. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from May 1944 acknowledged the strategic shift. The enemy can now provide fighter escort throughout the entire bomber route. There is no longer any portion of the journey where our fighters can engage the bombers without facing their escorts. The psychological impact of this development was profound. There were now no safe opportunities to attack. The sheer numbers of P-47s arriving in Europe contributed to the psychological pressure. Republic Aviation's enormous production capacity meant that by mid-1944, thousands of Thunderbolts were operating from bases in England, Italy, and newly liberated France. German aircraft production, despite increasing under Albert Speer's management, could not match this output. Luftwaffe pilots increasingly faced overwhelming numerical odds, with the knowledge that even successful engagements would see their opponents quickly replaced, while German losses were increasingly irreplaceable. One Luftwaffe pilot captured in July 1944 explained during interrogation, "Every time we shoot down an American fighter, 3 more appear the next day. When we lose a plane and its pilot, that loss is permanent. We all know this cannot continue indefinitely." This fatalistic outlook infected even veteran units that had once been the pride of Göring's Air Force. The relentless mathematics of attrition had created a psychological burden that technical skill could not overcome. The physical intimidation factor of the P-47 should not be underestimated. At nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109, the Thunderbolt's sheer mass made ramming attacks, occasionally used by desperate German pilots against bombers, suicidal when facing P-47s. The Thunderbolt would likely survive such a collision, while the lighter German fighter would be destroyed. This reality eliminated another tactic from the Luftwaffe playbook and reinforced the psychological advantage American pilots increasingly enjoyed. P-47 pilots recognized their aircraft's intimidation value and exploited it. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, the most successful P-47 unit, instructed his pilots to press attacks aggressively, knowing German pilots would often break off rather than face the Thunderbolt head-on. This psychological edge allowed American formations to disrupt German attacks on bombers, even when outnumbered. The reputation of the Wolf Pack, as the 56th was known, spread throughout the Luftwaffe, with German commanders specifically warning their pilots about the group's distinctive markings. The most successful P-47 ace, Francis Gaby Gabreski, with 28 air victories, noted in his combat reports how German tactics evolved when facing Thunderbolts. They no longer want to dogfight. They make one pass and continue straight through unless they have overwhelming numerical advantage. They've learned respect for what this plane can do. This observation from early 1944 reflected the psychological shift that had occurred in just months of combat between the P-47 and Luftwaffe interceptors. By spring 1944, the cumulative psychological impact of facing P-47s had contributed to a significant deterioration in Luftwaffe effectiveness. Pilot morale reports, captured in Allied intelligence summaries, indicated growing fatalism among German fighter units. One Luftwaffe group commander wrote in April 1944, "The men know they are fighting a losing battle. They see their comrades fall while achieving little against the enemy bomber streams. When they return to base, they often find it has been bombed in their absence. There is no respite, and the knowledge that the Americans now have fighters that can reach anywhere in the Reich weighs heavily on everyone." The Thunderbolt's ground attack capabilities added another dimension to the psychological burden on German forces. Beginning in early 1944, P-47s were increasingly equipped with bombs and rockets, allowing them to strike ground targets after escorting bombers to their targets. This meant that German airfields, previously targeted only by medium bombers, now faced the threat of fighter-bomber attacks that could arrive with little warning. The psychological strain of constant alert status affected ground crews and pilots alike, contributing to chronic fatigue that further degraded performance. The difficult decision facing Luftwaffe commanders, whether to oppose the bomber formations directly or preserve their fighter force for the defense of the Reich, became increasingly untenable as P-47s and other Allied fighters gained the ability to strike throughout German airspace. Choosing not to intercept bomber formations meant accepting devastating damage to German industry, while committing to interception meant accepting unsustainable losses against the bombers' P-47 escorts. This strategic dilemma created psychological pressure at the highest levels of the Luftwaffe command structure. General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters responsible for the Reich's air defense, later described this period as the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. By early 1944, we knew we could not win the air war. The best we could hope for was to inflict sufficient losses to cause the Americans to reconsider their bombing campaign. When the P-47 and later the P-51 gained the ability to escort bombers throughout their mission, even this hope became unrealistic. This admission from one of Germany's most accomplished air leaders reveals the psychological acceptance of defeat that had begun to permeate the Luftwaffe's leadership. For the German High Command, the changing air war dynamics created a cascading series of crises. Each bomber that reached its target destroyed irreplaceable industrial capacity. Each fighter lost in opposition took with it a pilot whose experience could not be replaced. The psychological burden of managing this lose-lose situation fell heavily on squadron and group commanders who had to motivate their men to continue fighting against increasingly hopeless odds. Many turned to the promises of new wonder weapons that would supposedly reverse the tide, a psychological coping mechanism that briefly sustained morale, but ultimately led to deeper disappointment. As Allied air supremacy grew more pronounced through 1944, German pilots began encountering P-47s, not just defending bomber formations, but actively hunting German aircraft near their own airfields. The psychological safe zone of operating near home bases was eliminated. One Luftwaffe pilot described the experience. Taking off was the most dangerous moment. The Americans knew our fields and would orbit high above, waiting for us to climb. We would be at our most vulnerable, low and slow, when they would dive with their superior numbers. Many comrades never even reached combat altitude before being shot down. The accumulating stress took a measurable toll on German pilot performance. Error rates increased, tactical discipline broke down more frequently, and squadron cohesion suffered as veterans were killed and replaced by inexperienced pilots. Psychological warfare became explicit as Allied fighters began conducting rat scramble operations, deliberate low passes over Luftwaffe fields to force German fighters into the air where they could be engaged under disadvantageous conditions. These tactics exploited the growing defensive psychology of the Luftwaffe, using their protective instincts against them. Technological developments continued to shift the psychological balance. By mid-1944, many P-47s were equipped with paddle blade propellers that improved climb rate and acceleration, negating one of the few advantages Luftwaffe fighters had previously maintained. German pilots who had developed tactics based on the P-47's earlier performance limitations now found these approaches obsolete. The constant need to adapt tactics in the face of improving enemy capabilities created additional psychological strain in a force already stretched to its limits. The impact extended beyond the pilots themselves to the entire German air defense system. Radar operators and ground controllers, observing the increasing dominance of Allied fighters, began providing more conservative guidance to their pilots. Intercept vectors became more cautious, sometimes directing German fighters away from engagements rather than toward them. This institutional caution reflected a psychological shift from offensive to defensive thinking throughout the Luftwaffe command structure. By the time of the D-Day landings in June 1944, the psychological battle in the air had been largely won by Allied air forces. The Luftwaffe's near absence over the invasion beaches reflected not just physical constraints but the culmination of a psychological defeat that had been building for months. German fighters appeared in only small numbers and engaged hesitantly, a far cry from the aggressive force that had dominated European skies early in the war. The final months of 1944 saw the Luftwaffe's situation deteriorate further as fuel shortages became critical. Training programs were curtailed and operational squadrons saw their flight time restricted to actual combat missions. The psychological impact of this fuel crisis was particularly severe. Pilots knew they were going into combat without adequate preparation, facing opponents with both technical advantages and superior training. The desperate nature of their situation became impossible to ignore. For German civilians watching the air war unfold above their cities, the psychological impact was equally profound. Early in the bombing campaign, they had drawn comfort from seeing Luftwaffe fighters rising to challenge the bomber streams. By late 1944, the skies increasingly belonged to Allied aircraft alone. The P-47, along with the P-51 Mustang, had helped create a situation where German air defense seemed increasingly futile, a psychological blow to civilian morale that complemented the physical destruction of the bombing campaign. As the war entered its final phase, the Luftwaffe attempted one last major operation, Operation Bodenplatte, the New Year's Day 1945 attack on Allied airfields. Among the priority targets were bases housing P-47 units, a tacit acknowledgment of the Thunderbolt's impact on the air war. The operation achieved tactical surprise, but resulted in catastrophic losses of irreplaceable pilots. The psychological desperation behind this high-risk operation revealed how thoroughly the strategic initiative had passed to Allied air forces. The experience of Luftwaffe pilot Hans Dortenmann captures the psychological reality of facing P-47s in the war's final phase. A skilled pilot with JG-26 who survived the war, Dortenmann recalled, "By 1945, we spoke of American fighters with a respect that bordered on fear. The Thunderbolt in particular seemed invulnerable to our standard attacks. You could hit one squarely and watch your rounds bounce off its armor. We had nothing comparable in durability. Each mission became a test of nerve as much as skill. This veteran's candid assessment reveals the psychological dimension that had become inseparable from the technical realities of aerial combat. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe had been effectively defeated months earlier. The psychological collapse had preceded the physical one, with pilot morale and effectiveness diminishing well before the final German aircraft were grounded. The P-47 Thunderbolt had played a crucial role in this process, creating a psychological burden on German pilots that complemented its physical impact on the battlefield. The terrifying reality of facing this formidable fighter had contributed significantly to the Luftwaffe's decline from an elite force to a broken one. Yet even as the air war turned decisively against them, many German pilots maintained remarkable determination. Operating under increasingly hopeless conditions, they continued to defend their homeland with the limited resources available. This persistence in the face of overwhelming odds speaks to both their training and their commitment, even as the psychological weight of inevitable defeat pressed down upon them. Their experience provides a powerful reminder of the human dimension that exists beneath the technical specifications and victory tallies of aerial warfare. As American industrial might ramped up in mid-1944, the full psychological impact of facing the P-47 Thunderbolt became even more pronounced for Luftwaffe pilots. Aircraft production figures tell the story. In July 1944 alone, Republic Aviation delivered 385 new P-47s, more than Germany's entire monthly fighter production. Each German pilot now faced the mathematical certainty that Allied fighters would always outnumber them, often by margins of 5-1 or greater. This numerical disparity created a psychological burden that technical skill or tactical innovation could not overcome. The consequences of this reality were immediate and severe for German pilots. Oberstleutnant Josef Pieps Priller, the commander of JG-26, and one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders with over 100 victories, described the situation bluntly in a July 1944 report to Luftwaffe High Command. "Our pilots now take off, knowing they will be outnumbered. They know they face aircraft with technical advantages. They know replacement aircraft and pilots are increasingly scarce. Despite this, they fight." But we cannot ignore the psychological effect of these circumstances. Even the most courageous men begin to calculate their diminishing odds of survival. By midsummer 1944, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine had undergone a complete transformation from its early war approach. Where German fighters had once been instructed to aggressively seek engagement with enemy aircraft, they now operated under severe constraints. A Luftwaffe training document from August 1944 instructed, "Conserve strength by engaging only when conditions offer clear advantage. Break off immediately if P-47s or P-51s appear in superior numbers. Priority must be given to preserving aircraft and experienced pilots." This defensive mindset represented a profound psychological shift from the offensive air war Germany had waged earlier. The pilots' experience on the ground between missions further eroded morale. Allied bombing had disrupted transportation networks throughout Germany, making it increasingly difficult to deliver spare parts, ammunition, and fuel to forward airfields. Mechanics worked miracles keeping aircraft flying with diminishing resources, but pilots could see the deteriorating condition of their planes. The knowledge that they were flying increasingly worn aircraft against factory-fresh P-47s created another psychological disadvantage before they even took off. Weather conditions that had once offered some protection now worked against German defenders. The P-47's performance envelope meant it operated effectively in conditions where earlier fighters had struggled. Major Walter Dahl, commander of JG-300, noted bitterly, "We once welcomed bad weather as it grounded enemy bombers. Now their fighters appear regardless of conditions, while our own operations are increasingly constrained by fuel shortages that prevent adequate training in adverse weather. This erosion of yet another tactical advantage added to the psychological pressure on German pilots. Even senior Luftwaffe leaders began privately acknowledging what frontline pilots already knew. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for aircraft production, confided to his staff in September 1944, "The Americans now have both numerical and qualitative superiority. Their P-47 can absorb damage that would destroy 3 of our fighters. While their pilots arrive with training hours, we can no longer provide our own men." This is not a temporary setback, but a fundamental shift in the air war. This admission from one of the architects of German air power revealed how completely the psychological initiative had been lost. For Luftwaffe ground crews, the psychological toll was equally severe. These men had once serviced aircraft between multiple sorties each day, preparing them for pilots who returned to base full of confidence. By late 1944, they were salvaging parts from wrecked aircraft to keep others flying, while watching increasingly exhausted pilots return from missions where they had achieved little against overwhelming opposition. The pride that had once characterized these ground units eroded as they faced the impossible task of maintaining combat effectiveness with inadequate resources. The dispersal of Luftwaffe units to smaller auxiliary fields to avoid Allied bombing created additional logistical and psychological challenges. Operations from forest strips and improvised runways complicated maintenance and reduced unit cohesion. Pilots and ground crews lived in constant anticipation of attack, with P-47 fighter bombers specifically targeting these dispersed operations. The psychological strain of this constant threat state contributed to chronic fatigue throughout the German air defense system. German civilians living near these auxiliary fields witnessed the deteriorating situation firsthand. A resident of Ansbach, Bavaria, wrote in her diary in October 1944, "Today we watched our fighters take off to meet the American bombers. 6 aircraft rose, while countless enemy fighters circled above. Only 3 returned. The young pilots look like boys now, their faces tense with the knowledge of what awaits them. We who watch from the ground feel their burden." This civilian perspective captures the psychological dimension of the air war that extended beyond the cockpit to entire communities. The growing capability gap between German and American fighters became increasingly difficult for Luftwaffe leaders to conceal from their pilots. By late 1944, technical intelligence reports comparing the P-47 specifications with German fighters were classified to prevent further damage to morale. When such information inevitably leaked to frontline units, it contributed to the sense that pilots were being sacrificed in a contest they could not win. This perception of futility became a significant psychological factor affecting pilot performance. Intercepted radio communications revealed the psychological state of Luftwaffe units. Allied intelligence analyses noted a marked change in German radio discipline during engagements with P-47s. Early war Luftwaffe communications had been characterized by calm, methodical tactical coordination. By late 1944, these same channels often captured panic and disorganization when thunderbolts were encountered. This breakdown in communications discipline reflected the psychological pressure German pilots experienced when facing an opponent they increasingly feared. The human cost of this aerial battle was staggering. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 21,000 pilots killed, captured, or seriously wounded, a casualty rate exceeding 90% of its early war strength. For those still flying, the statistical reality was inescapable. Their chances of surviving the war diminished with each mission. This knowledge created a psychological burden that affected every aspect of their performance, from pre-flight planning to combat decision-making. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots with 176 victories and a wing commander, survived the war, but described the psychological transformation he witnessed. "When the war began, we felt invincible, By 1944, we knew we were beaten in the air. The American fighters, particularly the P-47 and P-51, had achieved such dominance that we could only hope to survive encounters, not win them. This realization changed how we flew, how we fought, and ultimately how we viewed our own role in the war. For new Luftwaffe pilots entering combat units in late 1944, the psychological environment was particularly devastating. They arrived with minimal training to find veteran pilots who had abandoned the aggressive tactics that had characterized early German success. Instead of learning offensive maneuvers, they were taught survival techniques and evasion tactics. This defensive orientation, while necessary given the strategic reality, created a generation of German pilots psychologically conditioned to expect defeat rather than victory. The contrast with their American counterparts was stark. P-47 pilots arriving in Europe in late 1944 joined a force confident in its equipment, numbers, and training. They operated from secure bases with ample supplies and technical support. Their aircraft received regular maintenance with factory new replacement parts. This environment fostered an offensive psychology that contrasted sharply with the defensive mindset that had overtaken Luftwaffe squadrons. Colonel David Schilling, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, noted this psychological advantage in his after-action reports. Our pilots now pursue the enemy with complete confidence. They know their Thunderbolts can absorb punishment that would destroy any German fighter, and they press attacks accordingly. The enemy increasingly breaks off combat at the first opportunity, unwilling to test our advantages in a prolonged engagement. This observation from December 1944 captured how thoroughly the psychological dynamic of aerial combat had shifted. The winter of 1944-45 brought additional hardships that further eroded Luftwaffe morale. Severe fuel shortages meant pilots might receive only 1 or 2 gallons of fuel for training flights between combat missions, barely enough for takeoff and landing practice. American pilots, meanwhile, trained continuously between operations, further widening the skill gap. The knowledge of this growing disparity added another layer to the psychological burden German pilots carried into each engagement. Internal Luftwaffe documents from this period reveal increasing concern about pilot psychological health. A medical report from November 1944 noted, "Pilots show symptoms of combat fatigue after fewer missions than in previous years. Sleep disorders, anxiety, and physical manifestations of stress are increasingly common. The continuous pressure of facing superior enemy forces without adequate rest or rotation opportunities has created a force-wide exhaustion that medical interventions alone cannot address." This clinical assessment confirmed what squadron commanders observed daily. Their men were reaching psychological breaking points. The final German offensive in the West, the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, included a major air component called Operation Bodenplatte, designed to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and regain temporary air superiority. Preparations for this operation revealed the psychological state of the Luftwaffe. Many squadron commanders expressed private doubts about the mission's viability, while pilots prepared with the fatalism of men who expected significant losses. When the operation launched on January 1, 1945, it achieved tactical surprise, but resulted in catastrophic Luftwaffe casualties, over 300 aircraft, and many irreplaceable, experienced pilots. The psychological aftermath of Bodenplatte's failure was profound. Luftwaffe units that had committed their remaining strength to the operation now faced the reality that their sacrifice had achieved no strategic advantage. Allied air operations resumed at full strength within days, while German squadrons struggled to replace their losses. For many German pilots, this failed operation represented the final collapse of hope for any meaningful improvement in their situation. As the Allied armies pushed into Germany in early 1945, Luftwaffe units were forced into increasingly desperate circumstances. Operating from improvised airstrips, often with minimal ground support and dwindling supplies, they continued to face overwhelming Allied air power. The psychological burden of defending their homeland while witnessing its increasing destruction created a complex emotional environment for German pilots in these final months. Remarkably, some Luftwaffe units maintained their cohesion and fighting spirit even as the strategic situation collapsed around them. JG-7, equipped with the new Me-262 jet fighter, demonstrated that German pilots could still pose a threat when given advanced technology. Yet even these elite units operated under severe psychological constraints. Fuel limitations restricted operations, while the knowledge that Germany's industrial capacity was crumbling made each lost aircraft irreplaceable. The psychological burden of operating wonder weapons that arrived too late and in too few numbers created its own form of stress. For P-47 pilots, the final months of the European air war brought a shift in their own psychological orientation. As German opposition dwindled, many Thunderbolt groups focused increasingly on ground attack missions against transportation networks, airfields, and troop concentrations. This transition from air superiority to battlefield interdiction reflected their complete dominance of the skies, a psychological victory as significant as the physical one. Major Urban Ben Drew, a P-51 pilot who had previously flown P-47s, captured this shift in a March 1945 letter home. The Luftwaffe has essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. We now hunt for targets of opportunity on the ground, occasionally encountering a desperate German pilot who seems more intent on survival than engaging us. The contrast with the determined opposition we faced a year ago is striking. We have won the air war so completely that our greatest danger now comes from ground fire, not enemy fighters. This assessment from a frontline pilot confirmed the psychological transformation that had occurred. As Germany approached final defeat in April 1945, the psychological state of remaining Luftwaffe pilots varied dramatically. Some continued fighting with grim determination, motivated by loyalty or fear of the consequences of surrender. Others made calculated decisions to preserve themselves and their aircraft, flying to areas they expected would be occupied by Western allies rather than Soviet forces. Still others simply abandoned their planes, recognizing the complete futility of further resistance. The final Luftwaffe combat sorties flown in the war's closing days reveal the psychological diversity within German fighter units. Some pilots undertook suicide attacks against Allied bombers, having abandoned hope of survival. Others performed their duties mechanically, without either excessive risk-taking or particular initiative. A few attempted spectacular last actions, seeking to achieve some final victory before the inevitable end. These varying responses reflected individual psychological coping mechanisms in the face of certain defeat. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, approximately 1,500 Luftwaffe aircraft remained intact, many grounded due to fuel shortages or mechanical issues. This physical remnant of what had once been one of the world's premier air forces represented a fraction of its former strength. The psychological collapse had preceded the physical one, with a will to continue effective resistance eroding months before the final German aircraft were permanently grounded. For Allied intelligence officers debriefing captured German pilots, the psychological impact of facing P-47s emerged as a consistent theme. Major Alexander de Seversky, the prominent aviation expert who interviewed dozens of Luftwaffe pilots in the immediate post-war period, reported, "They speak of the Thunderbolt with a respect bordering on awe." Many described experiences of emptying their ammunition into a P-47 only to see it continue flying and turn to engage them. This created a psychological advantage for American pilots that went beyond the aircraft's actual specifications. This observation highlights how technical capabilities translated into psychological effects that amplified combat advantages. The statistical record confirms the P-47's impact. Thunderbolts flew more than 546,000 sorties during the war, destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft, with approximately 3,700 in aerial combat, while losing fewer than 1,500 in all causes. This kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 5.1 represented a devastating arithmetic for Luftwaffe units already struggling with irreplaceable losses. For German pilots, these numbers translated into a grim psychological reality. Engaging P-47s meant facing not just a formidable individual opponent, but a crushing statistical disadvantage. Post-war technical evaluations provided concrete explanations for what German pilots had experienced subjectively. The P-47's armor protection and structural strength exceeded any other single-engine fighter of the war. Its radial engine could continue functioning despite losing several cylinders. The 8 50-caliber machine guns provided firepower that could destroy an enemy fighter in a second-long burst. These technical advantages created the psychological impact that had contributed significantly to the Luftwaffe's decline from an elite force to a broken one. The human stories behind these statistics reveal the true psychological dimension of the air war. Walter Wolfram, a Luftwaffe ace with 137 victories, who survived the war, recalled his first encounter with P-47s in an interview decades later. We had been told they were large and slow, vulnerable to our more agile fighters. The first time I engaged one, I executed what should have been a perfect attack from behind. I saw my round strike the fuselage, but it seemed unaffected. Then it turned toward me with such unexpected speed that I barely escaped. After that, I approached thunderbolts with much greater caution. Many of my comrades were not so fortunate in their first encounter. For the American pilots flying P-47s, the psychological advantage became increasingly apparent as the air war progressed. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, the top P-47 ace with 28 aerial victories, noted in his memoirs, "We could see the change in German tactics by early 1944. They became increasingly reluctant to engage unless they had significant numerical advantage. When we did force combat, they would break off after initial passes rather than commit to extended dogfights." They had learned respect for the Thunderbolt's capabilities, particularly its ability to absorb punishment and its devastating firepower. This psychological dimension extended to how pilots handled battle damage. P-47 pilots routinely returned to base with significant damage that would have doomed most fighters. Colonel Hubert "Hib" Zemke, the legendary commander of the 56th Fighter Group, described watching a Thunderbolt land with half its rudder shot away, dozens of holes through the wings and fuselage, and the canopy shattered. Yet the pilot was uninjured and the aircraft repairable. This tangible demonstration of survivability created enormous confidence among American pilots while simultaneously deepening the psychological burden on their German opponents. The weather conditions over Europe often exacerbated the psychological pressure on Luftwaffe pilots. The P-47's turbo-supercharged engine performed exceptionally well at high altitudes, maintaining power where German engines lost performance. This meant that even the environmental factors that had once provided tactical advantages, such as using cloud cover for concealment, increasingly worked against German pilots. The knowledge that enemy fighters held advantages at all altitudes created another layer of psychological pressure. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in 1945, Luftwaffe pilots faced a final psychological burden, defending their homeland while watching it be systematically destroyed. Many reported the surreal experience of engaging American fighters while seeing smoke rising from their own towns and villages below. This emotional weight affected combat performance in ways that technical comparisons cannot capture. One Luftwaffe pilot, Georg Peter Eder, described flying over his burning hometown after narrowly escaping a P-47 attack. "In that moment, I understood completely that we had lost not just a tactical battle, but the entire war." The psychological impact of this realization was more devastating than any combat. The technological evolution of the P-47 throughout the war created additional psychological challenges for German pilots. Early Thunderbolts had demonstrated exceptional high-altitude performance, but were less maneuverable at lower altitudes. By mid-1944, improved variants with paddle blade propellers, water injection systems, and eventually bubble canopies for better visibility appeared over Europe. Each improvement negated tactics that Luftwaffe pilots had developed to counter earlier versions. This constant adaptation required psychological flexibility that became increasingly difficult to maintain under the pressures of combat and deteriorating circumstances. In the immediate aftermath of the war, both American and German aviation experts conducted detailed analyses of the air campaign. General Adolf Galland, who had led the Luftwaffe fighter force during its most challenging period, acknowledged in his post-war writings, "The P-47 created unique psychological challenges for our pilots. Its size suggested vulnerability, yet experience quickly taught that it could absorb punishment that would destroy any of our fighters." This contradiction between appearance and reality made it particularly difficult for new pilots to develop effective tactics. This assessment from one of Germany's most experienced air leaders confirms how technical capabilities translated into psychological advantage. For the thousands of German pilots who survived the war, the psychological impact of their experiences against aircraft like the P-47 often persisted long after hostilities ended. Many reported recurring dreams of being pursued by American fighters, unable to escape or effectively fight back. The sense of helplessness that had characterized their final months of combat remained a powerful memory decades later. This lasting psychological impact provides perhaps the most telling evidence of how thoroughly the air war had been lost, not just physically but mentally. The historiography of World War II air combat has often focused on victory tallies, technical specifications, and strategic outcomes. This emphasis can obscure the human dimension that ultimately determined how aircraft performed in actual combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt's impact extended beyond its impressive statistical record to create a psychological advantage that multiplied its effectiveness. Understanding this dimension provides a more complete picture of why Allied air forces achieved such comprehensive dominance by 1945. For post-war military planners, the psychological lessons of the P-47's success influenced fighter design for generations. The emphasis on pilot protection, structural strength, and firepower that had made the Thunderbolt so psychologically intimidating became standard considerations in fighter development. Aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed decades later, would incorporate similar priorities, recognizing that a fighter's psychological impact on both its pilots and their opponents represents a combat multiplier as significant as raw performance numbers. The final statistical analyses compiled after the war confirmed what Luftwaffe pilots had experienced subjectively. P-47s claimed approximately 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat in the European theater, more than any other Allied fighter type. When combined with the Thunderbolt's ground attack successes, over 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles destroyed, the P-47's contribution to Allied victory becomes even more apparent. For German pilots, these numbers represented not just military losses, but a comprehensive defeat that no tactical innovation could have overcome. Technical evaluations conducted on captured German fighters after the war revealed the stark contrasts that had created such psychological impact. The Bf-109, Germany's most numerous fighter, weighed less than half as much as the P-47 and carried significantly less armor protection. Its airframe could not absorb the punishment that Thunderbolts routinely survived. The structural differences between American and German design philosophies created an asymmetric combat environment where German pilots operated aircraft fundamentally more vulnerable than their opponents. The P-47's psychological impact extended beyond German fighter pilots to affect the entire Luftwaffe organization. Ground crews witnessed firsthand the damage their aircraft sustained compared to the punishment P-47s could absorb. Intelligence officers saw the statistical trends that made victory increasingly implausible. Command staff faced the impossible task of motivating men to continue fighting against overwhelming odds. This organizational psychological burden contributed significantly to the Luftwaffe's accelerating collapse in the war's final year. The experience of Luftwaffe pilots against the P-47 offers valuable insights into the complex relationship between technology, psychology, and combat effectiveness. Aircraft that create psychological advantages for their pilots while simultaneously imposing psychological costs on their opponents can achieve results that exceed their technical specifications. This dynamic helps explain why Allied air forces achieved such complete dominance by 1945, despite facing an opponent with significant technical expertise and tactical experience. For the American pilots who flew P-47s, the aircraft's reputation created a virtuous psychological cycle. Confidence in their equipment encouraged aggressive tactics that maximized the Thunderbolt's strengths. Success reinforced this confidence, creating a positive feedback loop that enhanced combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, German pilots experienced the opposite. Declining confidence led to increasingly defensive tactics that further ceded initiative to their opponents. This psychological divergence accelerated as the air war progressed. The operational realities of the late war Luftwaffe created additional psychological burdens for German pilots. Severe fuel shortages meant minimal training flights between combat missions. Critical spare parts became increasingly scarce. Ground crews worked miracles maintaining aircraft under nearly impossible conditions. But pilots could see the deteriorating state of their equipment. The knowledge that they were flying increasingly worn aircraft against factory-fresh P-47s created another psychological disadvantage before they even took off. By February 1945, many Luftwaffe units operated under day-of-action protocols, conserving fuel and aircraft for specific major operations while standing down on other days. This approach preserved resources but created additional psychological strain as pilots spent days anticipating combat rather than maintaining the regular rhythm of operations that helps manage combat stress. When they did fly, they knew they were committing their limited resources to what increasingly seemed like futile gestures rather than meaningful military actions. The introduction of the Mi-262 jet fighter in late 1944 briefly raised hopes among Luftwaffe pilots that they might regain some measure of technical advantage. However, the psychological boost proved temporary. Fuel shortages, maintenance challenges, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing meant the jet's potential was never fully realized. For pilots transitioning to the Mi-262 after flying conventional fighters against P-47s, the psychological whiplash of experiencing both technical advantage and continued strategic defeat created its own form of stress. Robert Johnson, the second highest scoring P-47 ace with 27 confirmed victories, observed in his post-war memoir that the psychological advantage of flying Thunderbolts became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Early in my combat tour, German pilots would engage aggressively, apparently confident in their abilities and aircraft. By 1944, their approach had changed dramatically. They became increasingly cautious, breaking off at the first sign of disadvantage. The reputation of our Thunderbolts had clearly preceded us, affecting enemy tactics before the first shot was fired. The material shortages affecting the Luftwaffe in the war's final months created psychological challenges beyond the direct impact on operations. Pilots increasingly found themselves fighting not just for strategic objectives, but to protect the diminishing resources that kept their units functional. When P-47s attacked German airfields, they threatened not just aircraft, but the fuel, spare parts, and maintenance facilities that allowed continued operations. This created a defensive psychology focused on preservation rather than achievement, a significant shift from the aggressive mindset that had characterized earlier Luftwaffe operations. For civilian populations under increasing Allied air attack, the visible absence of effective Luftwaffe opposition created its own psychological impact. German propaganda had long emphasized the Air Force's role in protecting the homeland. As P-47s and other Allied fighters ranged freely over Germany, the contrast between this promise and the reality became impossible to ignore. This civilian recognition of air defeat contributed to the broader collapse of morale and faith in ultimate victory, a psychological cascade that affected the entire German war effort. The post-war careers of Luftwaffe pilots who had faced P-47s provide interesting insights into the lasting psychological impact of their experiences. Many who joined West Germany's new Air Force in the 1950s or served as advisors to other nations' air forces emphasized pilot protection and aircraft survivability in training and equipment selection, lessons learned directly from their encounters with Thunderbolts. Their combat experiences against technologically superior opponents shaped military aviation development for decades after the war ended. In the final analysis, the P-47 Thunderbolt's contribution to Allied victory extended beyond its impressive combat record to include psychological dimensions that multiplied its effectiveness by creating confidence among its pilots while simultaneously imposing psychological costs on its opponents. The Thunderbolt achieved results that exceeded its already formidable technical specifications. Understanding this psychological dimension provides valuable insights for military planners, historians, and anyone seeking to comprehend the complex human factors that ultimately determine success or failure in combat. The terrifying reality faced by German pilots encountering P-47s represents more than a historical curiosity. It offers enduring lessons about the relationship between technology, psychology, and combat effectiveness. Aircraft that protect their pilots while projecting an image of invulnerability create compounding advantages that technical specifications alone cannot capture. The P-47 Thunderbolt's legacy includes not just its impressive victory tallies, but the psychological advantage it created, an advantage that helped bring the European Air War to its ultimate conclusion.